evening. Thank you to the Oshwal Committee for facilitating this platform. Welcome everybody. I am Surbi Malde and I am delighted to give you a short introduction to Alpa Shah. Alpa came into my life 45 years ago, so I can claim that I have now spent almost 2/3 of my life being influenced by her. She is daughter to my Papi Kundan and brother Madhusudan, both of whom are well known to many of you. Alpa, born and educated in Nairobi till the age of 15, completed her last 3 years of schooling in Wellingborough. Her academic journey started at Cambridge, where in 1997, she graduated with a first-class BA honours degree in geography. In 1998, she attained an MSc with distinction in social anthropology from London School of Economics. 1999 was a gap year to contemplate her future path, and this was also the beginning of her life in Ranchi, the state capital of Jharkhand, and in the surrounding villages. She spent most of 2000 to 2002 living in these villages for her PhD fieldwork. And in 2004, she graduated with a PhD in social anthropology from LSE. Both my Ma and I were overjoyed to be present at London School of Economics to witness her graduation ceremony. Alpa got married in 2006 to Rob Hyam, a fellow student from her days at Cambridge and who had since gained his PhD in geography. Alpa again spent a considerable time from 2008 to 2010 in Jharkhand villages, by now a most dangerous zone to be in. So what did Alpa have to do in these intermittent years of spending time in India? Before Alpa's journey, little did I know of what is social anthropology. Tonight's talk should throw a light on what this means. Through some of her narratives, I hope we learn to appreciate why these stories are important. Some of the qualities of Alpa that come to my mind are an inquiring and a challenging mind, but also very compassionate and courageous. Being the eldest of her generation from my father's side of family, Alpa constantly challenged our views as to the reasoning behind our Reet and Rivaj traditions and how and what we choose to celebrate, or what to study and which careers to follow. Alpa's quality of desiring social justice led her to a difficult research path and survived it to tell her story. In those early days, at the turn of this millennium, to keep in touch with Alpa in her villages was extremely difficult. There was no internet, no mobile connections there. We mostly had to wait for her to call us whenever she could go to Ranchi. Alpa's research has culminated in her academic success. A few years at Goldsmiths, University of London as a lecturer, and then returning in 2013 to her alma mater, LSE, where she is now a professor. Her research has been generously supported by major several million-pound awards from prestigious institutions in the UK, Europe, and USA, including from the British Academy, the European Research Council, and the UK Economic and Social Research Council. Alpa has also trained many postdoctoral researchers and PhD students who have worked in many parts of India, in Nepal, Bangladesh, and also in Latin America, in Chile, Ecuador, and on the borders of Brazil, Peru, and Colombia. Alpa is the author of more than 30 academic articles, 8 edited volumes, and 3 major books. They are In the Shadows of State, Indigenous Politics, Environmentalism, and Insurgency in Jharkhand, India, published in 2010, Ground Down by Growth, Tribe, Caste, Class, and Inequality in 21st Century India, published in 2018, and Night March, Among India's Revolutionary Guerrillas, also published in 2018. In the year 2018, she co-curated a major photographic exhibition, Behind the Indian Boom, at Brunei Gallery, SOAS, bringing together the works of all her PhD students and postdocs. The exhibition traveled to the LSE, and then to Turin, Italy, and was due to open in Barcelona, Spain before the COVID pandemic. Alpa has also reported on BBC Radio 4 and World Service on several occasions, including presenting and recording the radio documentary India's Red Belt for Crossing Continents. Through her books, photo exhibition, and radio programs, Alpa's research reaches out to wider public. With the publication of her Night March came various accolades from prestigious literary and academic institutions in the US, UK, and India. Night March was winner of the 2019 US Association of Political and Legal Anthropology Book Prize, shortlisted for the 2019 UK Orwell Prize for Political Writing, shortlisted for 2019 New India Book Foundation Prize, and longlisted for the 2019 Tata Literature Live Award. Night March was also a 2018 Book of the Year for UK New Statesman and Scroll India. It has been translated into Hindi, Bengali, and Italian, and a French translation will come out next year. A review of the Night March given by an 83-year-old Oshwal lady, Hansaben Patani. She read it within 1 week during lockdown, and this is what she says. Night March is a brilliantly written account of Alpa's 7 nights of march through the forests with guerrillas. I could not believe how a girl brought up in all the luxuries of life can go through what she has. You have to read the book to understand her courage. Well, just as well that contact via mobile phones was not an option for us in those times. Had we been aware of the multiple life experiences that Alpa has lived through, our family would definitely have had many a sleepless nights. Ladies and gentlemen, I have enormous pleasure in presenting to you Alpa Shah.
Thank you. Thank you, Surbi, for this lovely, kind, and generous introduction. It's such an honor to be introduced by you, for you will see that apart from being my aunt, you have also been one of my inspirations. I sincerely thank the Oshwal community for inviting me to talk today, and especially for this excellent initiative of talks in which we have already had so many inspirational speakers. Long may this continue. So my mother always teases me, "Taru kaam to koi di na pate." Your work never finishes. At one level, she is correct. To her, I am always working. whether it is evenings, weekends, squeezing in just 5 more minutes for reading, writing, for reflection. But at another level, she is wrong. For what I do is not so much kaam, a job, as it is a vocation. What's the difference, you might ask? If a job is what one does for a living to bring in some money to survive, a vocation is perhaps more of a calling that gives one deep satisfaction, fulfillment, even happiness, a sense of purpose. It makes it very difficult to distinguish between work and life. So it's a great pleasure to share with you a flavor of my life as an anthropologist. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to structure this talk in 5 parts. So let me just share my screen to explain how I'm going to do that. Let's see, slideshow. There we go. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, first I'm going to talk about what is anthropology. Second, I'm going to talk about how I got interested in anthropology. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about this place, Jharkhand. How did I land up there on the other side of India to where the Oshwal community has its roots for field research? Fourthly, I'm going to give you a flavor of what it means to be an anthropologist, to do anthropological fieldwork by sharing my life living with India's Adivasis and Maoists. And finally, I'm going to talk about some of the wider lessons of this work. So what is anthropology? You may wonder. Perhaps you think about skulls, or you think about bones and other kinds of human remains, or you think about how we evolved from apes, or perhaps you think about archaeological digs. In fact, what I do and what my department at the London School of Economics is known for is social anthropology. That is the in-depth study of societies, cultures, ways of life, usually different to our own. Social anthropologists research other people's ways of lives and perspectives in such depth that they show at least 2 things. Firstly, they show how wrong our initial perceptions are about those societies that we study. And secondly, they also turn the mirror back on us. They show us how narrow our own perspective and ways of life are. So in short, it makes what is familiar strange and what is strange familiar. Anthropology, therefore, has enormous capacity to change us by offering us infinitely more possibilities of how to live in the world. So let me give you one example by drawing on the research of the Polish-born anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski. He is the person who is considered the founder of anthropology, who went out to live in the Trobriand Islands, amongst the Trobriand Islanders in Melanesia in the South Pacific in 1915, and he was there for about 4 years. He found something very strange. I'm going to share my screen again. Here we go. He found something really strange. He found that these islanders, they would travel like miles and miles on these canoes across very dangerous seas. They go from island to island to island in a journey which they call the Kula Ring. Now, these were really risky journeys, and the whole community kept like going on these risky journeys. Why did they do this? What they did on these journeys was they actually exchanged goods which were completely useless. They exchanged armbands and they exchanged necklaces, which were actually of no monetary value and which they didn't keep, but they passed on to others. Why? The whole life was structured around this. So after 4 years or so, he came back to the London School of Economics and he wrote several books which actually challenged the fundamental premise of economics. So if economics showed us that human beings were first and foremost rational economic actors, Malinowski, through his study of the Trobrianders, argued we are not. he concluded that what people want and what drives our activity is actually to enter into exchanges with each other in order to create relationships which bind us together. It was this desire for us to be bonded to each other that explained the elaborate but useless strawberry and cooler ring. It was nothing that could be reduced to pure utilitarian or economic value. So Malinowski came to these conclusions that challenged the received wisdoms through a novel method. This novel method was that, previously people had studied other societies from their armchairs, or they had done so through translators or questionnaires, or, at the most, some kind of, brief interviews. Malinowski showed that this was just not enough. He showed that what you really needed to do to understand a society from their perspective was to learn their language, to go and live with them for several years, essentially to become one of them. Not just visit for a day or two, do a few interviews, run a few surveys, and come back, but follow them around wherever they went, not only to listen to what they said, but also to watch out for what was not said, the things that were done only in action, and the stories that were told only through action. We anthropologists call this participant observation, and the wider methods we call ethnography. Now, you might ask, how did I get interested in this seemingly obscure subject? And that's a question that people often ask me. There are no doubt many different reasons that had a bearing. First, there was the desire to alleviate poverty, oppression, the inequalities faced by many, which I felt required one to understand their conditions from their point of view, not from the ivory tower offices through which they're normally understood. Second, there were, all the brushes one constantly has with other ways of life different to our own, that makes one curious, want to know more about them. So, for example, climbing the sacred mountain of Aboriginals in Australia, in Uluru, with all my family, realizing that all of Australia had once belonged to them, and now they were the poorest people in the country. Or watching my father, Madhusudan, get pickpocketed by clever little gypsy girls in the streets of Naples. And while it was very annoying, wondering what drove them to it, how did they legitimize it? Or sneakily trying ugali and sukuma wiki, the lunch made by the Kikuyu servants in our middle-class Indian home in Nairobi, wondering what life was like for them in the slums of Mathari. Third, there were also, of course, all the personal influences in our lives. A father who always challenged the status quo, who argued through reason, not tradition, and who taught us to think for ourselves and by example set new paths. The female gynecologist who delivered me, Sarla Ben Maru, part of our extended family, who also challenged conventions, who chose not to get married and was one of the few working women growing up, when we were growing up. And my Aunt Surbi, who so generously introduced me today, who late in her life, after her second child, studied for a postgraduate certificate in education, became a teacher and got an au pair to look after her children and when she went to university. Again, breaking with tradition in her generation and opening up possibilities for others. Finally, I think that one of the reasons that I really got interested in anthropology was in order to open up a life beyond the Halari Visa Oshwal community into which we are born. So let me speak a little bit about this, because this lecture is hosted by the Halari Visa Oshwal community. When I was growing up as a teenage girl, you were told that you were expected to marry within your own community. You needed to be educated, and you'd probably need to get a job, whether it was as a dentist, pharmacist, or an optometrist. But this was in order to fulfill your role in reproducing the community. So even if you knew that one day perhaps you might go to university, and even if they were the odd women who had chosen a different path, the world could actually feel quite small, even a trap, despite your constant exposure to a vast universe beyond. Perhaps what really drove this point home to me was a trip to visit all the 52 Halari Visa Oshwal villages back in Jamnagar district, Gujarat, that my father had organized in 1991. I want to share some pictures, so let me screen share again. Here, there we go. So yeah, here's, all these villages that we visited. It was a kind of pilgrimage tour back to the lands of our grandparents and our great-grandparents. My father hired a bus and 30 of us drove from village to village, covering all 52 villages in a whistle-stop tour, meeting all the remaining Oshwal families, giving out shawls to every house. But what caught my attention was not just the Oshwal families we were meeting, but others who were peering at us from the margins. So there were women dressed in embroidered skirts and bare-backed blouses chatting on the thresholds of their houses. There were women making rotlas under the open sky next to their roadside makeshift huts. And those working in the fields, their saris hitched high. In fact, as you can see in these paintings, they not only caught my eye, but also those of my sisters. Seema has painted one of them, the one in the yellow sari, and my mother who painted the other. Until that trip, I always thought, that these were our villages. They belonged to the Oshwal community. That's how it was portrayed to us second or third generation migrants. But as we walked around those villages, I realized that while our community was numerically dominant, there were several other communities there too who were considered essentially different to our own. So some, like the Rajputs, were considered higher. So my grandmother Ba tells me that they even had to call their little girls and boys who were just 6 years old and 12 years old, by the name Ba and Pai. So Sejal Ba, Lila Ba, to a 9-year-old, when you are much older, they had to use the term Tame for the little children, the respectful we that one couldn't use for elders. But there were also others considered much lower who had to live in a separate part of the village. For instance, the Chamars who worked with leather, the Lohars who were ironmongers, the Musalmans, the Kumhars who made pottery. But the ones that really caught my eye were the Rabaris, whose women didn't wear saris like everyone else, but beautifully embroidered and mirrored lenga skirts and blouses with open backs. They sometimes stayed in the village and grazed the cattle of the village, and other times they set out on these nomadic pastoralist tours of the country with their camels living under the open skies on the roadside. Later, I realized that these communities were considered tribal by the Indian state and more popularly known across India as Adivasis. And then there were these families who were considered so low that they were not even allowed to live in the village. They had to have their houses outside of the village. These were the bhangi, or the sweepers and cleaners who had to clean the entire dirt of the whole village. Like almost everyone in India, our Oshwal community were part of and therefore reproduced a very hierarchical system of inequality, which categorized human beings on different scales of purity and pollution. This was religiously sanctioned in the caste system, in which some people are considered more polluted and therefore impure than others, simply because they happen to be born in a particular community. The Bhangis were considered so impure that even their touch, even their shadow was polluting. They weren't allowed to live in the village. They were forced to do the most polluting work, cleaning away everyone else's pollution, and they were treated almost like animals. So it was like a vicious cycle. They were considered polluting, so they did the most polluting work, which further polluted them. In fact, in colonial times, such communities found all over India were even called untouchables. In more recent times, a new term has become popular, Dalit, which means broken. It is used by the communities themselves as it doesn't contain the same kind of negative connotations as untouchables and has even become a part of their struggle against their oppression. The worst thing about this caste system was that you couldn't change your place in the hierarchy by anything you did. Born a Pangi, forever a Pangi. And this system of untouchability impacted millions of people, 16% of the Indian population, who lived across the entire breadth of the country. So I learned that these villages, which we called Halari Visa Oshwal villages, were not just the villages of the Oshwal community, but also belonged to many other communities that we knew almost nothing about, except in terms of stereotypes, that they were superior or inferior, most commonly inferior. Their communities were polluting, their women loose. I was in my first year of university at that time, right? I was reading geography at Cambridge. I didn't even know what anthropology was. But then I realized that the best books I was reading, the ones that really challenged me, that taught me to see the world in completely new ways through the eyes of others, and therefore challenge all the stereotypes held by those allegedly acting on their behalf, development organizations, charities, for example, they were all written by anthropologists. So I started going along to some anthropology seminars and lectures. I'll share with you some of the people that influenced me. Here we go. So, I listened to Professor Caroline Humphrey explaining the caste system, showing me a whole new side of village India that I had only partially observed or sensed through our trip to Halar. I read Professor James Ferguson's Anti-Politics Machine, about how a Canadian-funded development project in Lesotho completely failed because it was designed by people who did not think to ask local people what their ground situation was. I listened to Professor James Fairhead and Melissa Leach challenging the stereotype that Africans are responsible for deforestation and creating deserts. They showed that local people in Guinea, where they worked, had in fact reforested vast parts of the country, and we could learn from their practices. So the more I read, the more I realized anthropology's power in challenging conventional stereotypes through deep research amongst people who are usually ignored, people who are usually marginalized and even silenced by almost everybody. And thus I realized its power in opening our worlds to new perspectives, new possibilities, and in contributing to better ways to understanding and challenging and changing the world. So I decided, okay, I've got to do a master's in anthropology to really, find out more about this. And I chose the department that Bronislaw Malinowski, the father figure of anthropology, had set up at the LSE. By the end of my master's, I was drawn to learning much more about India, this land where we had our roots. But as I had learned through my degrees, both my degrees, we in the Oshwal community, in fact, knew very little about. So I decided to spend a year in India. Where was I going to go? In fact, I had no idea. But the one thing I knew was that I had to go somewhere that was not connected to the Oshwal community so that I could be free to learn beyond it. So I landed up in this place called Jharkhand, land of the trees, totally by chance. One of my professors at Cambridge had a research project running there. It was part of a big UK government Department for International Development program trying to improve irrigation and agriculture in the area, which only had rain-fed farming. And he asked if I wanted to get some field experience, knowing that I was looking for it. So what did I do? I opened up the Lonely Planet. This was back in 1999. Jharkhand was then part of South Bihar. Let me show you a map of where it is for those of you who don't know it. There it is in yellow over there, and that's Gujarat over here, completely on the other side. Yeah, what did the Lonely Planet say? Well, I mean, for a start, the size of it's the size of Ireland, the Jharkhand. It actually contains the richest mineral reserves of India, a huge wealth of coal, iron ore, bauxite, and more. Yet it was mainly unelectrified. Its people were largely illiterate and very poor. The Lonely Planet had only given half a page to it. And it said that apart from a few waterfalls and a Jain pilgrimage site at Parasnath, Samad Sikar, I've put up a photo of that here. It said that this is one of the most dangerous and violent parts of the country. It's got very little tourist infrastructure. The message was, don't go there. So I thought, perfect. I boarded the plane to Ranchi, which was at that time a quiet, sleepy town. Now it is a very bustling city, capital of Jharkhand. You'll see that, in the time when I was there, this is the busiest part, the central part of the city, and there's hardly any cars in those days. This is taken in, peak kind of traffic time. I spent the next 6 months in Jharkhand. The first 3 months, by night, I slept in the project office in Ranchi, and by day, I traveled from village to village in remote forests in a Maruti van with Sanjay Kumar, an Indian forest officer who later became a family friend who was working with my geography professor. I also visited many villages in Bihar itself. After those 3 months, I thought, this is no good. You can't just scoot from village to village in a Maruti van and know what people want or need. You need to stay with them, become one of them, learn their language. I had to do what anthropologists call ethnographic fieldwork, I thought, that deep, immersive research living amongst people you are studying. So I found a small 2-roomed shack with an outside toilet and occasional electricity in the rural town of Bero of about 4,000 people. We would call it, of course, a village here, a small village. I moved there with a college student who I hired as a research assistant to cook and translate for me and teach me Hindi. Unlike so many of you, I didn't grow up on Bollywood films, so I didn't know any Hindi. I was trying to learn it back in England at SOAS, but it was really in Ranchi in Bero that I learned Hindi. For the next 3 months, every day we went to the Rural Development Block Office, the most grassroots office of the state, responsible for implementing all of the development programs, the building of schools, the building of roads, the building of community centers, distribution of food for the poor, all of these programs that they were responsible for. And those officers there, they were always sitting amidst their dusty piles of papers, half eaten by red ants. They were slightly amused that 2 girls in their 20s wanted to hang out, and so they tolerated our presence. But although they were supposed to be the main interface between the state and the villagers, I realized that they were mainly upper caste men who rarely went to the villages, and they held all kinds of very negative stereotypes about the villagers. So I realized that I needed to go deeper still. To do that, I applied for a PhD place at the LSE. I secured funding for 4 years, and I asked 2 professors in the department there who were considered international experts on India, on South Asia, to supervise my work. Professor Chris Fuller and Professor Jonathan Parry. Let me show you a picture of these men who are still around, now retired. I returned to Jharkhand in 2000 for another 18 months. This time, I wanted to live right in the heart of the forest villages. My friends in Ranchi, middle-class people, they said, go in the daytime with a driver and a car and come back, to Ranchi by night. They said, don't stay there. The project head of that Department for International Development project back in the UK, he said, you're a British citizen and it's too dangerous. There's wild elephants that tear down houses. There were. There's armed guerrilla insurgents in the forest. There were. And the people are jungly, wild, savage, and barbaric, they said. They even sacrifice children. Who were these jungly folk? They were India's tribal people, its indigenous people, commonly stereotyped as, yes, wild, barbaric, savage as the forests in which they lived. A more popular recent term to refer to them is Adivasis, meaning original inhabitants. They consist of, a range of different groups: Mundas, Orans, Hos, Paharias, Birhor, Koya, Kon, Sora, for instance, who most commonly inhabit the forests and hills of central and eastern India, but also in the states of the northeast. They make up about 8% of India's population, but are considered so low that they're thrown actually right outside of the caste system. They're not even a part of it. It's no surprise then that these are also the poorest social groups in India, and many of them have in fact fled to the jungle margins, considered uninhabitable terrain by most other people. So here I chose a village of about 100 households, all mud huts, about an hour's walk from the nearest STD-ISD booth in Barrow. Remember, these are the days before mobile phones, as Surbhi Fabar reminded us, to make my home. There were no sanitation facilities. You went with your lota and the pani to the forest, no electricity, no running water, only open wells that you lowered your bucket into and one tube well. When I tell Ba, my grandmother, about these villages, she says that in 2000, they seemed even more poor than our Halari Visa Oshwal villages in Gujarat 80 years before. Who knows? I found a Munda family courtyard with an unfinished mud house that they were using to keep goats. I asked if I could finish off the mud floor, get rid of the colony of rats that had made up nest there, put a door in and make it my home. Here it is. This was the house that I lived in just there. There it is. This was my courtyard. Now, of course, when I said that, then the men from the dominant caste of the village, they were Yadavs, they just swarmed around my arrival. They said I must live with them in the middle of the village, not with these calls, they call them. It was a derogatory race system that they use for mundas, a bit like how Indians in Kenya use the term kala. But I knew that if I did that, the Adivasis would always consider me as part of the dominant caste and never open up with me and consider me their own. It would have been the equivalent of staying with the Oshwals in Gujarat or Kenya when I really wanted to learn about the Rabaris or the Bhangis or the Kikuyu. So I stood my ground. I moved into the Munda courtyard with the sister of the girl who had helped me before. She lived with me for 9 months, and for 9 months I was alone. I tried to understand all the many dimensions of the economics, politics, and religious landscape of the village as deeply as possible by hanging out with local people. So I went with the Munda women to collect firewood from the forest. I went to the fields when they sowed their and harvested their rice. I went with the old men to graze cattle and watch them prepare for hunts and fishing expeditions. I walked an hour with children to the nearest school and played with them, you know, in the village. I went to every religious festival, many weddings, many funerals. I went to every village meeting I could. I participated in political demonstrations. On Mondays and Fridays, I walked with the villagers who dressed up in their best to go to the local market for their weekly outing. On many a night, I got up with the villagers to light flamed torches to scare away wild elephants that were breaking down their houses and eating up their crops, accompanying people to demand compensation from the forest department, taking people to hospital, where one woman who was trampled by an elephant. And I wrote a lot of notes, day and night, hours. So after a year in the village, when I realized that many villagers go for 6 months of the year to carry bricks in factories in faraway destinations, I went with them. I spent a week living with them in a labor slum on the edge of Calcutta on the banks of the river Hooghly, 500 people sharing 3 taps of water, shitting and bathing all in the river. Some years later, when I realized that many Adivasis were joining left-wing insurgents who had taken up arms to bring about a more equal world, to fight for social justice, I knew I had to understand that more deeply. So I returned to Jharkhand for another year and a half. It was the world's longest standing armed insurgency that was spreading in the area, Marx, Lenin, and Mao inspired. They were called Naxalites after the village of Naxalbari in West Bengal, where they had their first rebellion in 1967. By the time I could return for another long spell of 18 months between 2008 and 2010, these Maoists were considered India's greatest internal security threat, and I was married. Fieldwork would be challenging. Journalists and human rights activists were being kicked out, and hundreds of thousands of security troops were being sent to circle the areas. So my more than 6 foot English husband, who would have stood out like a sore thumb. So I left Rob behind in London, and I went to live in an Adivasi village in the guerrilla strongholds. I had actually very modest aims. I wanted to understand how life had changed for the Adivasis in the face of this revolutionary movement. But I ended up getting to know the guerrilla armies too, for they were everywhere. Towards the end of my 18-month stay in their strongholds, I marched with them in a platoon for 7 nights from Bihar to Jharkhand across 250 kilometers in the dark at the peak of counterinsurgency operations, trying to eliminate them. This is frames my book, Night March. In the last 20 years, there have been many challenges along the way in doing this work, this research. How did I face them? So in the toughest times of my fieldwork, in fact, I remember the strength of the women in my family. My ba, who had sailed across the Indian Ocean in a dhow to a foreign land to be with a man she barely knew, not knowing when she would ever see her own family again, a very common story. My aunt Nutan, who gracefully faced so many unsurmountable challenges with a brave smile and an open, vast heart, and who once more is being tested now with the departure of my dear uncle Pankaj Fua less than a month ago. It is these women, Nutan's story is completely extraordinary, not at all normal. It is these women who really have faced so much, who gave me the courage to carry on, as they still do. So perhaps my first challenge was learning Nagpuriya. This is the local language. For in those villages, very few people speak even Hindi. Now, when I go back, the women of my Munda courtyard, they laugh. They say they remember the day when they found me crying because I thought I'd never be able to learn. The second challenge was health. Mosquitoes were everywhere in the rainy season and malaria was rife, not just the ordinary vivax variety, but the Plasmodium falciparum, which causes cerebral malaria. All the villages had it, and it was inevitable that I was going to get it. But my Dutch historian friend Katinka Sinha and her Bihari psychiatrist husband Vinod Sinha, who lived in Ranchi city, where I also kept a flat, saved me. A few months later, I broke a leg and was on crutches, looked after again by Katinka and Vinod, and my sister Deepa, who had come to spend 6 months in Ranchi to work at the hospital there in between changing from a dentistry degree to a medicine degree. But perhaps the most difficult challenge was the politics of actually staying as close as I could to understanding the Adivasis in the villages. Because there were always others, dominant others, who wanted your ear, who wanted to explain things from their point of view, and who wanted to prevent you from living with the Adivasis. Whether it was the British head of the UK DFID project who said it was unsafe for me to live in those forests, or the police jeep of armed men who would turn up to the village and quiz the villagers about what I was doing there. But with time, the Munda family around my courtyard accepted me as one of them. One thing that helped a lot during my first long field trip between 2000 to 2002 was that my parents and my sisters came to visit and stay with me in the village. And after that, I became a proper person in their eyes, not just somebody who had, dropped out of the plane from the sky. You have to remember, people didn't have an idea of national boundaries. They were really illiterate. When I talked about England, they thought that it was another village very far away. And over time, I actually also became a part of their families. People in other villages came to say I was Budwa Munda's sister or Laura Baba's niece, or that, Hemant and Himanshu of my nephews. One day in 2016, more than 15 years after I had first lived in those villages, I even went to the tea gardens in Assam to search for a long lost part of my Munda family back in Jharkhand. So in the 1930s and 40s, back then, Laura Baba, who was like a kind of father to me in the village, he had spent 4 years with 2 of his brothers laboring in tea gardens. Let me show you a picture of him here. Here we go. So yeah, there he is. So yeah, these are the tea gardens in Assam. 2 of the brothers had returned back to Jharkhand, but one brother had stayed on, and they had lost touch and they had no news of each other for several decades. And I realized I was in the village, and then I was going to Guwahati, which is in Assam, for a conference. And I asked Laura Baba if he could remember anything about the tea plantation he had worked in. I told him I can try and go and see if I can trace, his brother, my uncle. So he said he's an old man, he could, not speak a lot. And he said, but he remembered. He said, Dibrugarh Zilla, Chabwa Thana, Dikkam Bagan, Kotibari line 3. He had it kind of memorized in his head. So that's the only information I had. I boarded the flight from Ranchi to Guwahati via Calcutta. I looked up my conference program. There was one day free when I didn't have a speaking engagement where I could kind of just, be noticed as unnoticed if I went. But Dibrugarh, unfortunately, was 450 kilometers away, more than a 10-hour drive. The plane stopped at Calcutta airport. I rushed to the ticket counter to see if there was any other way I could get there. And then there was a flight I could fly one afternoon and return the next, and then I could see what happened in the 24 hours in between. So I said, let's do it. I bought tickets. I landed in Dibrugarh. I hired a taxi and found Chabwa Thana. And then I went with this driver from tea plantation to tea plantation, searching for line 3 and a Munda household that had roots in Jharkhand. It was futile. It was nearly dusk. The driver, who by then thought I was deranged, he said, we have to give up. It's getting dark. He was right. I ought to find a hotel in Dibrugarh to stay the night. One last try, I pleaded to him. I was in luck. I found the house, but the brother was dead. Only a married son survived, who had been born on the tea plantations. So I thought, how is he going to understand who I am? A crowd had gathered around my arrival. So I said to the boy, Sukra, I am your fufu. I'm your father's sister, and I have come from your village in Jharkhand. I was speaking in Nagpuria. I come with greetings from Laura Baba, from Sukher Dada, from Budwa, from everyone else. So he looked at me and he asked, then, would you like some tea? So I knew that, I was welcome. I told the driver goodbye. I'll make my own way back to the airport the next morning. Sukra would take me, I told him, and he did. But only after he had taken me to meet all the people from the surrounding villages and the plantation, who served me haria, rice brew, the rice beer that they make in the village, and called his sister, who was married on another plantation, to come and visit me, taken me to see his aunt, who was in hospital, taken me to see the grove of trees. You can see it here in the corner, where the ancestors were buried. And today, my Munda family, and that's the airport where he dropped me. We actually walked to the airport after taking a rickshaw half the way. Today, my Munda family in Jharkhand and Sukra in Assam are reunited via the mobile phone. They keep in touch, and they have promised to visit each other. I'm not sure, though, that Sukra knows that I'm not actually his aunt, only his anthropological aunt. So there are many things to say about this trip, like how much worse off the families in the tea plantations were than those back in Jharkhand, who are already very poor. But I tell you this story of how I reunited two parts of my Munda family in Jharkhand to make the point that our research as anthropologists is so deep and immersive that we even become a part of the families who were once complete strangers to us. Our bonds are not only academic, but emotional, psychological, and deeply personal. And it is this depth of research that transforms us as people and allows us to contribute new insights into the world. For by becoming a part of the lives of others who are very different to us, understanding their perspectives and experiences in as holistic a way as possible, we are able to challenge the stereotypes that are held about them and provide novel insights into the world. So perhaps now you may understand why what I do is a kind of vocation rather than just work. So let me now turn to the final part of my lecture and give you a flavor of just a few of the things that I have learned. So the first set of issues is to do with economic growth, inequality, and poverty. Now, we think that India is modernizing, that the old hierarchies and oppressions of caste are disappearing, that economic growth is the way forward. It's good for everybody. It'll eventually trickle down. Everyone, including those at the bottom, will be better off. Now, there is a small truth to this. People are not as poor today as they were 50 years ago, but this rosy picture hides far more than it reveals. It hides the inequalities that have really escalated in recent years, the vast gaps between the richest and the poorest, which have increased dramatically. If dollar billionaires now mark the Indian landscape with air-conditioned malls, high-rise apartments with swimming pools, equally there is an India of dislocation and despair, indebted farmers committing suicides, Dalit girls raped and hung, many still dying of hunger, with 8 Indian states containing more poor people than in sub-Saharan Africa. The trickle down of India's economic growth has been really a very slow drip. Moreover, the stigmas of caste and tribe have not gone away at all in modern India. Rather, they have continued, transformed, and are found in new places. Adivasis and Dalits, who make up 1 in 25 people in the world, are still at the bottom of the social and economic hierarchy. If you look at the worst jobs in any sector, whether it is in a village environment or in factories in the cities, it will be Dalits or Adivasis that are doing them. So they're lifting the heaviest loads, they're doing the most toxic and dangerous work. Me and a whole team of anthropological researchers found ample evidence for this across the country, whether it was in the tea plantations of Kerala or the chemical industrial belt of Tamil Nadu. Stigmas of caste persist so much that Dalits seeking jobs in the city will hide their caste identity, because otherwise no one will rent a room to them. With Adivasis, the situation is perhaps even worse. Today, they have been painted as terrorists. This has legitimized a very brutal counterinsurgency operations against them, which we simply don't hear about here. The forests of Eastern India, where I live now, are a military zone. Hundreds of thousands of Indian security forces circulate with their weapons and their battleships. Entire villages have been burnt down. Rape and killings are routine. Just last week, the police opened fire at people who were protesting against yet another police camp being set up in Chhattisgarh. They killed 3 poor Adivasi villagers, saying they were Naxalites. These kinds of human rights abuses are everyday affairs in the forests of India. The jails of Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Orissa are filled with thousands of Adivasis who have not even been brought to trial, imprisoned as alleged Naxalites. Many who can have tried to flee the area. There's been a very slow clearing out of the areas. Why? Why when hardly anything remains of the Naxalite insurgents? They're just a small little band, like there's hardly anything left of them. Well, underneath Adivasi lands lie some of the richest mineral reserves in the world. Multinational corporations of every hue are waiting to dive in to harvest them. But these lands are constitutionally protected for Adivasis because of historic battles they fought to protect their lands. So either you have to change the laws or you forcibly get rid of people and take away the land. Human rights defenders say that this is why such a brutal counterinsurgency against Naxalites, alleged Naxalites, is waging in India. It allows for the clearing of Adivasis of their land so that the mineral wealth can be extracted for the billionaires to make their millions. My own research shows that many Adivasis in the guerrilla strongholds had over time some connection with the underground revolutionaries. And this is not because they have been coerced, coerced into, forced to do so, nor because of any simple grievances, as is commonly thought. The revolutionary leaders, many of whom were upper caste men from middle class families who had been underground for several decades, they were almost like the closest parallel I could find was Jain monks who had renounced all of their material possessions, or renounced all their families in order to create a nirvana, to reach moksha, not in another world, but create it in the here and now. In general, unlike most outsiders, they were kind and caring towards the Adivasis. So the Adivasis naturally, welcomed them. They created bonds of emotional intimacy through their gestures. These people had been considered and treated savage by everybody else. And so over time, the Adivasis, went to live in their guerrilla armies like they were going to stay with an uncle or an aunt. So a much more complex situation than what you hear in the mainstream media when you hear about it in India. So those who dare to speak out against this, against what is going on in these areas, against the brutal human rights abuses of Adivasis, but also of Dalits and Muslims that is happening right now in India, are now themselves being jailed. So these are the middle class intellectuals, lawyers, human rights activists in the last 2 years, in what has famously become referred to as the Bhima Koregaon case. 16 intellectuals, lawyers, and human rights defenders have been jailed, including several who have been invited as academic guests at the LSE. The labor lawyer Sudha Bhardwaj, 70-year-old Dalit intellectual Anand Teltumde, an 80-year-old Jesuit priest, Stan Swami, who has devoted his entire life to working for Adivasis, who's now not even able to walk. He has Parkinson's, jailed on ludicrous charges for which there is no evidence. And this is at a time when COVID is running through. People are being, states are releasing prisoners, but these people are being imprisoned without even any evidence that is being shown and without being brought to trial. Today's human rights abuses and state repression in India is comparable to China and Russia. So when you next see the white-chested Prime Minister promising Achhe Din, do think again about what is being hidden from us. The greatest tragedy for me is what is happening to the Adivasis. For perhaps the biggest lesson I have learned is that if everyone thinks that these are wild, savage, poor tribes who need development and education, what I have found in them is actually that there are communities that we can all learn from, with ways of life of unfathomable riches that exceed any crude measurements of GDP, income, or assets. Let me just give you 3 brief examples by considering art, the environment, and gender relations. So traveling through the forests of Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, or Orissa, it's hard not to have your breath taken away by the wonders of the region. This is not just the beauty of the forests, but especially of the Adivasi villages. Very clean and picturesque. And you can see art everywhere, art in the craftsmanship of a teak door, in the cheery swirls of the hand painting of mud walls. That's my sister Seema learning how to paint them. You can hear it from the song of monsoon raindrops on handmade roof tiles. You can hear it in the carving of each wooden cowbell, which is designed in a different way to play a different note when the cattle return home in the evenings. And you can feel it in the linking of arms in the village dancing circles, singing together and playing drums. What I learned about art from the Adivasis is that it is not the preserve of elites for exhibition, but it is joy created by everyone for everyone. It encompassed life itself. The environment. Something that we all have to consider our attitudes towards in these days of looming climate change. What I learned about the environment for the Adivasis was that it was not something to be exploited, harvested, and conquered, but a commons to be enjoyed and shared by all, where there was no separation between nature and culture. And finally, gender relations. I mean, what was really remarkable about these forested areas is the status, respect, and freedom that women have, which I have simply not seen in Indian communities. Women danced, they drank homemade brew, rice beer, wine made from the mahua flower alongside men. They worked outside the home. They often held the strings of the purse. They had the freedom to leave bad relationships and start new ones without being stigmatized or ostracized. They had many of the freedoms that feminists have long fought for and that are so hard to find in much of India, and that we all need to celebrate. So if I started off thinking that I wanted to work in development to make a better world, what my research has shown me is that we need to question such top-down assumptions of development, whether it is the World Bank, UK Department for International Development, so smaller NGOs, charities, for in fact, we really need to learn from people like the Adivasis about how to make a better world. And perhaps what our energy should focus on is not charity, but giving them the freedom and resources to live on their own terms. Right now, this means fighting for their release from prisons, where thousands of Adivasis are incarcerated without trial, arguing for the removal of Indian security forces from their forests, questioning the need for multinational mining companies and power plants who are taking over their lands, It means valuing and respecting the riches of Adivasi communities rather than seeing them as jungly. And it means challenging our own our own ideas, our own conceptions of civilization, development, education, by thinking about what we can learn from communities like them. So to briefly conclude, in my last few seconds, I hope that, I just wanted to say that I hope that I've given you some flavor today of what anthropology is and what its power can be. And I hope that in this process, I've also given you some insight into people in India who are part of our own history and so important to our future, to the future of humanity, but who get hidden by a focus on our community, our temples, and our pilgrimages. So if you'd like to know anything more about any of the things I've talked about, I have written some of the books, some books as Surbi mentioned, and I will just highlight maybe, so there's In the Shadows of the State, there's Ground Down by Growth, but the one that I'd like to recommend, because it has been written for a general audience, so anybody can read it. My mother can read it. That was my idea. Hansa Ben, if you are listening, thank you so much for your kind words about it, which Surbi passed on today. This is Night March, and it's very available on Amazon and any other online bookstores or any bookstores which sells books. I hope that if you enjoy it, I hope that if you read it, you will enjoy it. Anyway, thank you for listening, and all power to all those of you who are walking the least trodden path. All power to you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Alpa. That was really a wonderful presentation that we had today, this evening. Just like to read out a few of the comments that we have received today. I know you've not been able to read any of them, but it's been quite amazing. There haven't been as many questions as before, but I think it just goes to say that what you have done in your life, what you have presented today, I think people have been left speechless. They don't know what to ask in some ways. So here goes. Let me just read out a few of them to you. Sujata Harya said, great introduction and what a plethora of achievements. I loved anthropology units at university and found the studies fascinating and loved my time in India with the Adivasis. So Sujata shares some of the experiences you had with Adivasis. Sailesh Pai Shah says, congratulations for your achievement at a young age and do keep it up. One more further down. Very informative session from Dilip Kumar Somchan Shah. Alpa, you are very brave to go to Jharkhand. Wish you all the best in your endeavors. Very well introduced by Surbi Malde. One more. We have learned so much and command your bravery and enthusiasm. So Alpa, on behalf of everyone watching this amazing presentation, thank you very much. Just like to ask Nitaben, do you have any questions?
Yes, Alpaben, great presentation. And from your talk, we learned you've taken on lots of challenges. And, it's good to know a young person or a young woman, being so brave to go and actually experience and find out. So well done. I would just like to know, would you go again to live with the Adivasis and find out what is still happening there and any challenges from when you went there? I know it's COVID, but I don't know, have you ever thought that you would like to go back and see what's still going on?
Oh, thank you for your question, Nita Ben. Yeah, we have life. It's a lifelong relationship. with the places I worked in. So I have returned many a time in the last 20 years. And of course, I can't go back now because of COVID. But
Yes,
my hope is
definitely.
that I will eventually introduce my young daughter to those areas and to the people, and they are all keen to meet her. And, so it is most of us anthropologists, we have lifelong relationships with the communities that we work with. So, yes.
It's good to hear that, and I'm sure your daughter will enjoy and find out what you had experienced over there.
Alpa, I
Thank
have a
you.
question for you. When you were there, what was the scariest moment that you actually endeavored in all that time, 4 years that you were there?
There were so many. I think the more interesting question for me in the many moments which were difficult, challenging, was, as I said, remembering all these people in my life who had much more scary moments. I mean, there's so many scary moments. There was security forces. There's a counterinsurgency going on, right? There are police forces. At one point in Night March, I was walking with a platoon of, 30 men, 80 men. I was the only woman dressed as a guerrilla, because I had to do that in order to walk with them. There were encounters all the time. People were dying. These areas were surrounded by security forces. I was worried about traitors within the guerrilla platoon. There was that one particular guy who was a platoon commander. If you read Night March, there is this kind of suspense about what happens to this platoon commander. And by the end of the book, I'm completely very skeptical of what he's doing and whether he's actually working for the Indian security forces rather than the guerrillas, and what's going to happen to us on this march. There were so many things happening. So many scary moments all the time, in many different contexts. But I think for me, the more interesting question was like, what happens in those moments? Like, so as I said, I was thinking about people in my life who have, in my perspective, are much more brave than I am. My aunt Nutan, my ba, all these people. But I was also thinking about the people I was with, and the fact that they are doing this every day. For them, for me, there was always ways to get out. One day I would come back to my nice house in London. This was just a moment of my life. For the people I was with, this is their life every day, and so I think all those things put into perspective, the things that you might be facing, and they actually give you strength to carry on. And so those things which are scary, they stop being scary. So now I can't even think about these things as scary things, if you see what I mean. So in a way, your question is like, I think we have to look at it from the other way around.
True, very true.
Yeah. Thanks.
We've got a couple of questions which have just popped up, Alpa. Nanak Das is asking, is there any risk that you may be arrested by the central government as aiding and assisting terrorists?
Oh, thank you for this question, Nanakji. Of course, this was always, something that one is worried about, because anybody who has association with the Naxalites, can be under scrutiny. But I think that, everything I have written, like you will see my book, Night March, it's a deeply sympathetic account of this movement. It's trying to show, who these people are as human beings, but it's also a very critical account of what they're doing, the methods that they've taken up to change the world, how their use of arms actually backfires on themselves. It actually makes gangs in their own communities. It produces what they call Frankenstein's monsters. So as you see, like Night March is this kind of absolute tragedy, because it shows the beauty of what is being created in these areas, but also how that is, being totally destroyed. So people have said it is there have been many reviews of it, and it has been celebrated as a kind of balanced and nuanced and sophisticated account of what is happening. So, I hope that all of those those things speak very clearly to my own positions and reflections and my role, first and foremost, as an educator in the world, and showing the importance of education, of learning and knowing, and then sharing that information more widely.
Thank you, Alpa, for that. Nitaben, do you have a question there?
No, I think most there is one question from Pirsha. Would you now be able to live in Bhavangam and do something similar for the Oshwal community?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think as I started off my presentation, what one of the things that I really realized is that this Bhavangam and the Oshwal community is actually a very small part of the Bhavangam, and I think it's really important that somebody is able to, you know, do a fuller study of these villages, and which includes, you know, all of the other communities and our place in that, and you know, kind of comparative work. I think that probably now I feel that I am sufficiently, in a way, you know, we are too close to our own community to do a study, a kind of more critical study of them. And so I hope that, like, by now, you know, like with all this experience, I would be able to go back and do a study of the Bhavangam, or help somebody who might be able, who might want to do that. But I think it's very difficult for people who are from that community to undertake a study of their own community, you know, through the kinds of methods which I've used, which are, you know, very critical, and which require you to, you know, transform yourself and to transform your own perceptions and stereotypes. So I think it's a very important question. And I think that there are studies that need to be done deeply that we haven't got at all right now. So yeah, thank you for that question.
It's okay. Thank you, Alpa.
Alpa, there is a question here which Sujata has asked. What did you learn about yourself as a person as a result of all this work?
Oh, it's such a difficult question. As well, I think I learned that one of the most important qualities that we need as people who want to change the world, make it a better place, is humility. So being willing to think that, you know, the way we think is not you're challenging what we think, right? So challenging all our received wisdom. So being open and learning, and that requires listening and watching, you know, and I think that those are the kinds of skills that I've really had to finesse and learn, and then yeah, I mean, it's yeah, that's a very big question, and so many things you learn, right? Because it's a whole life journey. It completely transforms you doing this kind of work, which makes you, it opens you up into other possibilities, other ways of being in the world, and therefore it makes you realize the narrowness of your own perspectives before, and I think that that's really powerful and very important.
Thank you, Alpa. There's one other question here. Narendra Pai Shah has asked, Alpa, what touched your inner self most whilst you are on the night march?
Sorry, when you ask this question, I'm just thinking about all the stones that were on the ground because we had to sleep, you know, under the stars and all kinds of places, and there were all these places which were just so rocky and pebbly, you know, and they really got to me. But that is not at all what you meant. You didn't mean my outer self. You meant my inner self, you know. Yeah, I think that, you know, yeah, it's seeing the bravery of all these people that are out there who are undertaking, who have given up their lives, you know, sacrificed everything they knew for this cause, which is actually so futile, you know. So I was really, really deeply touched by, I mean, all of these experiences. Not the march was just a kind of, it was just like the icing on the cake, so to speak. It frames a whole experience. Yeah, to see that people have given up everything, all the comforts of their homes and everything, because there's no other way they feel to change this world, to make it a better place, because the structures are so against them. And I think that really touches your heart. And then to see the futility of it, that how it's going wrong, how despite all of this, that they have given up all of their lives, everything, it's so futile, they aren't going to be able to create this moksha. In fact, they're creating something very, very dark and much worse in their actions. So to see that kind of disjunction, I think, and the impossibility of the situation, that really touches you. Yeah. I never expected to think of these kind of revolutionaries as like being like Jain monks, but really, they were so comparable. So that I think that was something that was like kind of not something I didn't expect at all.
Thank you.
Janie Gutka has asked, it would be interesting to hear how people initially reacted to learning that you were working with the Adivasi community, and how your work has helped improve these attitudes.
Well, also it's a very difficult question for me to answer because I don't really know, but I know what I dreamed of but never expected I'd achieve is for this work to get out so widely in the Indian public sphere. So I get emails and letters and so much, from people in India who have read my work and who have changed their minds about how they see the Adivasis. So yeah, especially with the writing of Night March, because it's written for a wide audience, people, and because it's been very well received in India, which is something that I dreamed of but never expected to achieve. I think that has made a big, that has made a big difference for me. But ultimately, these stereotypes are so entrenched, and I'm really glad that the work is getting translated into local languages, because you really need it. So, English is spoken only and read by certain people, but really in many of these villages, it's still Gujarati or Bengali or Hindi or Tamil or Kannada. So I'd like it to get translated in more languages. I want it to be translated in Gujarati, especially. But yeah, so far we've had Hindi and Bengali translations.
That's really good. Thank you. Tushar Shah has asked, are you planning to do research on the indigenous communities? Example, Borana, Somali in Kenya, and Khoi and San in Southern Africa.
Oh, thank you for this question. Yeah, there is some really fantastic research that has been done on some of these communities, especially the San in Southern Africa. I mean, I can recommend you things to read if you'd like to know more. As an anthropologist, you can't really spread yourself out between too many different communities, because the requirements are, you have to go so deep. So I don't plan myself to do any research on the indigenous communities in Kenya and Southern Africa, though in a different life I'd love to have that. I'm very committed to carrying on working in India, in Nepal, where I've also done some work, and in parts of South Asia, which I have devoted my life to kind of learning more about. But yeah, there is excellent work going on, and students in our department, but also professors who have done long-standing work in these regions. So yeah.
Thank you, Alpa. A couple of questions. These will be the last ones, we promise. Suryakant Pai Shah has asked, have your findings been brought to the attention of those in power, i.e. the Modi government, and what can be done for them?
Yeah, I don't know if the Modi government has read my book. I would love it if they did. But I have to be, I think that the government is not going down the right path at all. The Modi government in these areas, and it's not just the Modi government. I mean, the Congress government were on a similar path before, but the whole attitude has been very much, as I was saying in my talk, prioritizing multinational corporate interests over the people in the area. So, and my last, the preface to Night March, the new preface of the paperback, which is coming out in England in November, but has already come out in India, is basically a plea to remove all of these lockdowns, various forms of lockdowns, not just the coronavirus lockdown, but the locking up of all of these regions, all of these people in jail. So I think that this is really important, but I don't see the political will to do this right now. In fact, it's going the other way. It's become, much worse, so that people like me or my counterparts, they are also being put in jail. So all the people, as I was saying, intellectuals, middle-class intellectuals who have, who've been working for many years on these issues, who are not at all Naxalites, they are being put in jail as alleged Naxalites, and I know that they are not. I know the Naxalites in the forest. I know these are intellectuals, human rights lawyers. That the people that have been charged, many of the people who have been charged in the Bhima Koregaon case, it has been covered a little bit in the newspapers here. It shows that the will to listen is not, it seems that the will is not there. It would be great if if there was more will, if things changed. Yeah.
Thank you. Speaking of counterparts, we have a question from Raj Shah, and he's asked, did you work with or interact with any local anthropologists whilst in India?
Yeah. So it's very interesting in India. Anthropology, in a local anthropology is very much a kind of old-fashioned anthropology, or anthropology which developed with colonialism in India, which used to be about measuring cranial indices and actually categorizing and documenting tribal cultures. It's a very different kind of practice. But I worked with many local scholars. Over the years, I have known many local scholars and spoken with many local scholars, but they don't tend to do this kind of deep, in-depth study, living with the people. So they live in the cities, and it's not that often you get scholars in India who are doing this kind of work, living in a different community to their own in depth and for years. So I think this is a space also that I've been very interested in developing. So I've been and I've been working with Adivasi scholars and Dalit scholars a lot, not necessarily anthropologists, but scholars in other fields. I have at the LSE, I have invited many over to the LSE. I have created an Adivasi fellowship program where junior young career scholars from India came for a few weeks to develop as earlier career scholars, to give them an opportunity to do that. So I've worked a lot with local scholars, and I'm really interested in working more with Adivasi and Dalit scholars, but not necessarily only anthropologists. Yeah.
Thank you. Last question. So what's your message in a simple, say 1 or 2 sentences for all the young viewers that we have probably listening in today or later on once we put it on YouTube, as in view it later on, for the people who are maybe approaching university age or looking at careers further afield? Any words of wisdom, please?
Well, follow your passions. Always challenge, always think, always look beyond what you are told. Challenge received wisdoms. Look to challenge received wisdoms. Question what you are told, and be open to learning about other ways of being, other ways of thinking about the world. And I think in this world, we really need to be concerned about issues of inequality, social justice, and the Oshwal community has developed so much. We have so much wealth between us, we've done so well, we've been educated. And now I think it's also time for us to look beyond the community, look beyond to people who are much less in a better place than not in as good a place as we are, and to contribute to thinking about a world which is more inclusive, more equal, and more just. And I say that, with your heart and soul, think about these questions and follow your heart. And yeah, and yeah, maybe I should end there.
Thank you, Alpa. That was great. Just a few words of thanks to the people behind today's event. First and foremost, want to thank Madhusudan Bhai for introducing us to Alpa and promoting the whole event. We've had viewers from Kenya, we've had viewers from Canada, and I'm sure in the days to come, there'll be a lot more people watching this presentation today. So Madhusudan Bhai, thank you very much. Subiben Malde for introducing Alpa and giving us a good insight into what her journey has been, right from childhood up to now. Alpa, I just want to read out one comment we've just received a few minutes ago, which sums up what people have felt today. It's from Vaishal Shah. It says, an amazing and courageous journey. One can never fully appreciate what you may have gone through, but clear descriptions and insights show the difficulties of it. Excellent piece of life's work. Keep it up. Thank you. So Alpa, thank you very much from OA UK. And finally, big thank you to the Zoom team today. Nita Ben from Luton, Paresh from South area behind the scenes. This is goodbye from the Zoom team at Oshwal. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.